It's August 1905 in the small village of Communies, Switzerland. Jean Lamfray, a French laborer, stands before 3 coffins, weeping. "Tell me I haven't done this," he sobs. "I loved my family. I would never do this." In the coffins lay the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters, ages 6 and 2. Jean shot them all with his rifle after a day of binge drinking. At the trial, his defense paints a picture of absinthe madness. They call in a psychiatrist who claims that only the absinthe Jean drank early that morning could have made him commit such an atrocious and inexplicable act of violence against his family. In the end, Jean Lamfray is convicted of 4 counts of murder. To add to the tragedy, an examination of his wife's lifeless body showed she was pregnant with a son at the time she was killed. Jean will hang himself in prison 3 days later, and his crime will go down in history as the Absinthe murder. News of it will tear through Europe and travel to the United States, capturing public attention and outraging an already apprehensive crowd. In Communies, where the crime was committed, the mayor will declare, quote, "Absinthe is the principal cause of a series of bloody crimes in our country." 82,000 signatures will be raised in just a few days, and by 1910, Switzerland will become the first country to ban the contentious green drink altogether, followed shortly after by most of the Western world. The green fairy will transform into the green demon, a scapegoat for the degradation of modern society. But what if I told you that Jean Lamfray didn't stop at 2 absinthe drinks that day early in the morning, diluted in water? During his lunch break, he downed 6 glasses of strong wine, plus another one before leaving work that afternoon. And then on his way home from work, he stopped at a cafe and he had a black coffee with brandy. And then once he got home, he polished off a liter of wine, downing the last few drops just before murdering his entire family. The prosecution at his trial argued in vain that it was the excessive quantities of alcohol he had consumed and not the absinthe that caused such violent behavior. But decisions had already been made in the court of public opinion, and absinthe was to blame. But where did those opinions come from? Was it just bad science, or did money have something to do with it? Competition from a formidable wine industry, perhaps? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shayla Fontaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. This topic, absinthe, was suggested by Hannah on Instagram. Keep the topic suggestions coming, you guys. I promise I write all of them down, even if I haven't gotten to them yet in literally years. I promise, if you've ever messaged me a topic idea, it is on a list somewhere. You can follow me on Instagram if you don't already, at History Fix Podcast. You can message me there. You can also email me, historyfixpodcast@gmail.com. Those are probably the 2 best ways to get up with me. But, while we're talking about housekeeping here, you should know that I released a not so many fix last week over on Patreon about the mysterious death of Amy Dudley, wife of Robert Dudley, who was definitely a close friend of and may or may not have been a secret lover of Queen Elizabeth I. And I say it's not so many because it ended up being over 30 minutes long. So it's basically a full History Fix episode. Join me to get to the bottom of what exactly happened to Amy, who was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1560 with a broken neck and 2 head wounds, one of which was 2 inches deep. Not sure how you sustain a 2-inch deep head wound after falling down just 8 steps, but come join me on Patreon to ponder that further. That's patreon.com/historyfixpodcast. podcast, which is always linked in the description. On to today's topic, absinthe. What exactly is absinthe? Well, it's a beverage, of course. It's an alcoholic beverage. But what is it made out of, and what sets it apart from other alcoholic beverages, liquors and wines and whatnot? Absinthe is mostly alcohol. It also has some spices, stuff like that in it, most notably star anise and fennel, which give it a licoricey taste that I don't particularly enjoy, but I guess people like. But what makes it absinthe and not just licorice-flavored liquor is one particular ingredient, an herb called wormwood, or Artemisia absinthium, if you want to get scientific. Absinthe has to be quite strong alcohol-wise. A percentage of at least 50% alcohol is required to keep the wormwood oil in suspension, like mixed in to the liquid, not separated. So it's a strong alcoholic beverage like liquor. But the wormwood sets it apart because wormwood contains a chemical compound called thujone. This is the psychoactive ingredient, kind of like the THC of wormwood, right? THC is to cannabis, as thujone is to wormwood. And like THC, thujone affects the brain by inhibiting GABA receptors. But let's go ahead and get to the spoiler here. Thujone does not actually cause hallucinations. The idea that drinking absinthe causes hallucinations or something similar to like doing a hallucinogenic drug like acid, LSD, is not true. That is a myth born out of paranoid public fear and disdain for absinthe and a bunch of slightly buzzed artists experiencing the placebo effect. Now, in super high quantities, thujone can cause convulsions and like muscle spasms, seizures. But here's the thing. In order to consume enough absinthe for that to happen, the convulsions, you would have consumed so much alcohol that you would actually die of alcohol poisoning before the thujone could do its thing and cause these convulsions. So while absinthe stands apart from other liquors due to the thujone GABA inhibitor found in wormwood, its version of THC basically, it is still mostly just a type of liquor with around 70% alcohol in it or 140 proof. All right. Got that myth out of the way early. Now let's talk about the history. Use of wormwood goes back to ancient times. We know that the ancient Greeks used it because it shows up in the writings of Pythagoras, Hippocrates, Pliny the Elder, Galen, etc. The Greeks had a sort of elixir that they called absinthion, which is where the modern name comes from, that they made by soaking wormwood leaves in probably wine. So pretty similar to modern absinthe, this mix of wormwood and alcohol. Except the Greeks were using it as medicine. They were not using it recreationally. It was used for all kinds of things medicinally: childbirth, menstrual pain, jaundice, anemia, rheumatism, bad breath, even a remedy for swooning. And then after the Greeks, wormwood continues to be used medicinally. British herbalist John Gerard wrote in 1597, quote, "Wormwood voideth away the worms of the guts," end quote. So we know it was used as a sort of anti-parasitic then. We also know that it was used during the 17th and 18th centuries in England to fumigate houses during outbreaks of bubonic plague. So they would burn wormwood, kind of like how you might burn sage, to fumigate and cleanse the air of plague germs. Not sure how effective that actually was, but, they're trying. Wormwood and sage are actually super similar. They're both part of the Artemisia genus of plants. It wasn't until the late 1700s that wormwood concoctions became a beverage in Europe, absinthe. The invention of modern absinthe is usually credited to a French doctor named Pierre Ordinaire in 1792. And note, he was a doctor, so there's still a medicinal aspect to this. But you know what? At the same time, that can't possibly be true. It couldn't have been Dr. Ordinaire because 23 years prior to that, there was an advertisement placed in a Swiss newspaper by a Suzanne Marguerite Henriade, advertising a remedy called Bon Extrait d'Absinthe, which was made of alcohol, wormwood, anise seed, lemon balm, and some other herbs. Absinthe, essentially. Dr. Ordinaire just sort of adapts Suzanne Marguerite's recipe and then claims the fame, as men are often wont to do in these fields and in all fields, really. One of my sources says that Suzanne Marguerite and her sister were Dr. Ordinaire's housekeepers. I can't substantiate that. I found it in one source and nowhere else. Anyway, Ordinaire becomes recognized as the creator of modern absinthe when he mixes 8 different plants, including wormwood, anise, hyssop, and fennel, with 136 proof alcohol. So that's 68% alcohol, this beverage that he's making. Dr. Ordinaire's concoction catches on big time in his French village as this sort of cure-all. And it's here that it gets the nickname the Green Fairy, because absinthe is green. It's this sort of light green color. That's from all the green herbs in it, wormwood, but also hyssop, lemon balm, stuff like that. And then fairy, because it seemed to be this magical cure for a lot of ailments, right? And this recipe gets passed on to a Major Henry, well, I guess I should pronounce it correctly, a Major Henri Dubaid, who buys it from Ordinaire, or possibly from the Henriade sisters. I'm saying all these names wrong. I'm sorry. In 1797. And this guy, this Major Henri guy, he, along with his son and his son-in-law, found the Pernod distillery, and they start pumping out absinthe commercially. In 1830, France conquered Algeria, and they sent in troops to sort of man this new territory, as many as 100,000 troops by 1840. And these French troops were completely miserable. Serves them right, stealing land that didn't belong to them, but that's neither here nor there. They were miserable with the climate, the heat, bad weather, fever tore through their ranks. And so they started giving the French troops in Algeria absinthe. It was supposed to help with the fevers, cure dysentery. They used it to disinfect the drinking water so that they wouldn't get sick from the water, which is probably why they had fevers and dysentery to begin with. But honestly, it was probably just the alcohol doing that, right? Disinfecting the water, not really the wormwood. But anyway, the French troops were digging the absinthe rations. They liked the absinthe. It was making them feel better, whatever. When they returned to France, they brought a taste for it with them. So they're returning to France. You have to imagine they're returning to France as these sort of heroes, right? These conquerors, and they like absinthe. And so this trend kind of catches on, and other people are like, well, if they're drinking absinthe, I want to drink absinthe because they're awesome, and I want to be awesome, right? And so the French soldiers from Algeria sort of bring the love of absinthe back to France with them. According to Jesse Hicks, writing for Distillations magazine, quote, "At first, absinthe remained a middle and upper class indulgence, but it had an exotic appeal. Legends grew about its long history and supposedly hallucinogenic effects. As prosperity spread, more people partook of l'heure verte, or the green hour of early evening, when the unique smell of absinthe wafted through the air. Savvy customers realized that with its high proof, absinthe delivered more force for the franc. Diluted in water, virtually no one could drink it straight. It went even further. By 1849, the 26 French absinthe distilleries were producing some 10 million liters, a small fraction of the prodigious amount of alcohol consumed in France." End quote. So 10 million liters sounds like a lot, but to put that in perspective, it was really just 3% of all the alcohol consumed in France. Just 3% of it was absinthe. They were drinking a lot of alcohol in France. Then the artists got involved. Painters and poets began to view absinthe as this magical substance that liberated creativity and led to genius artistic breakthroughs. Manet, Degas, Van Gogh, Picasso, to name a few, they all drank and painted absinthe. Ernest Hemingway called it, quote, opaque, bitter, tongue-numbing, brain-warming, stomach-warming, idea-changing liquid alchemy, and said, quote, it's supposed to rot your brain out, but I don't believe it. It only changes the ideas, end quote. This is likely part of where the misconception that absinthe is a hallucinogen came from. These artists believed that it was having this really powerful effect on their minds, in much the same way that later groups of artists would use LSD's actual hallucinogenic effects for creative liberation. But according to Adrian Santos Longhurst, writing for Healthline, quote, as for some of the world's most significant and innovative artists believing that absinthe gave them a creative edge, they were likely referring to the effects of early-stage intoxication, which includes feelings of euphoria, excitement, and self-confidence. Plus, according to various reports, many of the artists and writers who were inspired by the Green Muse also had a penchant for other mind-altering substances, including opium and hashish, end quote. So yeah, they were just kind of drunk. I feel like there's definitely also some kind of a placebo effect happening here. They feel hallucination-y because they think they're supposed to feel hallucination-y, that kind of thing. But Hemingway's quote there, it's supposed to rot your brain out, is a clue to what's going on behind the scenes with absinthe, a twisting, a dismantling of public opinion. This started in the mental health community and with a psychiatrist named Valentin Magnan. So Magnan was physician-in-chief of the St. Anne Mental Asylum in France around 1867. This was France's main asylum. It was the Bedlam of France, right, if you will. And so in this very prominent position, Magnan, this guy, he became France's national authority on mental illness. Now, Magnan was very concerned about what he believed to be a degeneration of the French race. He felt like mental illness was on the rise and that the once great nation of France was in decline because the people were unwell mentally. Now, that was probably mostly because people were being diagnosed with mental illnesses at a much higher rate than they once were due to the burgeoning field of medicine in the second half of the 1800s. Not that there were actually more mentally ill people. They just used to fly under the radar before that, because no one knew anything about mental illness. But also, the strains of this new industrial life, long work hours, filthy living conditions in crowded cities, this all probably put a lot of strain on people mentally too. So yeah, you're going to see some fallout from that sort of a societal shift, that sort of a lifestyle shift. But Magnan is sort of freaking out, thinking that France is going to hell in a handbasket because everyone is losing their minds. And, mind you, he is within this world of mental asylums. So it's it probably does feel like that. That's a kind of a scary job. But, Magnan, he's becoming all paranoid about the degeneration of the French people. He's working in this mental institution. At about the same time, the anti-absinthe movement is kicking off, and he begins to relate the two. He begins to blame absinthe for this degeneration. He coins the term absinthism as a condition distinctly different from alcoholism. Absinthism is basically alcoholism, but with absinthe instead of alcohol. Never mind the fact that absinthe is roughly 70% alcohol. No matter. This is a completely different health concern, of course. In 1869, he publishes the results of an experiment that he did to try to prove that absinthe was dangerous to your health, more dangerous than just alcohol, of which it is mostly comprised, I should say. So he's trying to prove that wormwood, I guess, is dangerous to your health. So here's what he did. He put a guinea pig in a glass case with a saucer of pure alcohol, And then he put another guinea pig in a glass case with a saucer of wormwood oil. And he also put a cat and a rabbit in glass cases with saucers of wormwood oil. So the glass case is sealed off, right? No fresh air. So they're breathing in either alcohol or wormwood. And the guinea pig in the alcohol case just sort of got drunk. The other three animals with the wormwood oil appeared to become excited, and then they started convulsing. They started having seizures. And because of this, Magnan insisted that absinthe was different enough that it needed its own category, and that it was dangerous enough that it should be banned. Now, there are a lot of problems with this experiment, which were pointed out right away, even in the 1800s. The main one being that the small animals in sealed glass cases inhaling the pure wormwood oil were quite different than a much larger human consuming a minuscule amount of wormwood oil diluted in a large quantity of alcohol. Yes, wormwood, thujone, can cause seizures in large quantities, but these large quantities were not present in absinthe and could not be consumed, as I said earlier, without the consumer first dying of alcohol poisoning, we now know. Now, if he had put pure alcohol in one saucer and absinthe in the other, maybe that would have made more sense. But they don't really understand that back in the 1800s. They don't really know about how to conduct a valid science experiment or anything like that. So Magnan publishes these results, and it's enough to convince a lot of anti-absinthe people that the stuff is indeed very dangerous. Right after Magnan publishes his studies, 1870, 1871 was the Franco-Prussian War, which France lost. And for a lot of people, this was proof of the degeneration of the French, what they call the poisoning of the population. France was clearly falling behind its enemies, and more it was being blamed on absinthism. They believed that absinthe was reducing the population and putting otherwise healthy, virile Frenchmen who could have been out fighting the Prussians in the madhouse. But it wasn't until the Absinthe murders in 1905 when Jean Lemfray killed his pregnant wife and his two young daughters in a drunken rage that the final nail went into Absinthe's coffin. Hicks writes, quote, "Still, it took the Lemfray murders in 1905 to convert many citizens into activists. Previously, the absinthe drinker symbolized moral decay, but he had never truly crystallized into a violent threat to society. Doctors disagreed about the danger, with Magnan and his disciples declaring absinthe the root of all social evil. On slim evidence, some even linked it to tuberculosis. Meanwhile, other physicians continued to tout its health benefits, prescribing it for gout and dropsy as a general stimulant of the mind and body, as a fever reducer, and as the perfect drink for hot climates. Kind of ironic that they're prescribing absinthe for gout, since gout is quite often caused by alcohol. But anyway, amid the medical uncertainty, support for an outright ban remained a minority stance. After the Lemfray murders, absinthe consumption became a serious political issue, as people throughout Europe, reading lurid headlines about the absinthe murder, demanded action." End quote. And somewhere around here, the wine industry also got involved behind the scenes. When a wealthy wine producers started supporting banning absinthe, for obvious reasons. Now, as I said earlier, if you remember, absinthe only accounted for around 3% of the alcohol consumed in France. Wine accounted for something like 72%. Absinthe could not touch the wine industry, but, probably better to just go ahead and take it down anyway, just in case. Back in the 1880s, some sort of plant disease had infected French vineyards, leading to wine shortages. And in the absence of wine, a lot of people had turned to drinking absinthe instead. And then even after the wine industry sort of bounced back from this, some of those people continued to drink absinthe because at that point they had just acquired a taste for it. Still never more than 3% of all the alcohol consumed in France. Not that many people, but the wine industry was not cool with people converting from wine to absinthe at all. It seemed to be, the beginning of a possible trend that they very much did not want to continue. And so they jumped behind the movement to ban absinthe. At the same time, Magnan had made this clear distinction between absinthism and alcoholism, which allowed the wine industry to completely avoid any kind of blame for this poisoning of the people, this degeneration. All of it was blamed on absinthe, not alcohol. The irony, of course, being that it was actually the alcohol in the absinthe doing the poisoning, not the wormwood. Switzerland became the first country to ban absinthe in 1910. If you remember, this is where Jean Lamfrey murdered his family, in Switzerland. The U.S. banned it in 1912. France banned it in 1915, spurred along by the vengeful wine industry. And by the 1920s, almost every country in Europe, except for Spain, Portugal, and England, where it was never really that popular to begin with, had banned absinthe. Germany banned not only the sale of absinthe, but also the distribution of the recipe. The recipe itself was illegal. It wasn't until the 1970s, well, absinthe was still banned, actually, that we began studying it, like on a chemical level, like with actual science, not guinea pigs in glass cases. For the first time, we looked at the molecular structure of thujone, of this chemical thujone, and what it actually does in the brain, that sort of thing. In a lot of ways, it's similar to THC. They have a similar molecular geometry. They are metabolized in a similar way in the human body. They are both terpenoids, which is something. They both inhibit GABA receptors in the brain. So in the 1970s, they sort of made this breakthrough that thujone and THC were very similar. Later, research proved that while they do have all this in common, they actually do very different things in your brain. They have a different effect on the brain. But, GABA inhibiting terpenoids nonetheless. In all of the research that has been done on thujone, nothing at all suggests that it would cause hallucinations. It just doesn't appear to do that. It can cause convulsions and seizures in high quantities, we know. 60 years post-absinthe murders, almost 100 years post-Valentin Magnan, now in the 1970s when this research started, they're like, what was all that poisoning and degeneration they were talking about, right? At wormwood, thujone doesn't really seem to do that. And so starting in 1991, countries in Europe started to legalize absinthe, make it legal again, produce it again, sell it again. But they limited the amount of wormwood, of thujone that could be in it. They figured, if we go light on the wormwood, we can avoid this sort of degeneration they were experiencing back in the 1800s, early 1900s. They must have been putting way too much wormwood in there, and people were having seizures or whatever, because seizures and murdering your family totally go hand in hand, right? So anyway, they limit the amount of wormwood that goes into modern absinthe. But interestingly enough, they have since tested old absinthe, 100-year-old samples of absinthe, the original pre-ban absinthe, and it has even less wormwood in it than the modern stuff. So no, the absinthe they were drinking back then was not causing seizures or hallucinations. Definitively, it was not. The U.S. has lifted the absinthe ban. I think in 2007, the U.S. lifted its ban on absinthe. But in the U.S., it actually has to be thujone free, despite the fact that we have proven the thujone in absinthe causes no ill effects whatsoever. Whatever. So what was happening, though, right? Why were people seeming to lose their minds and ruin their lives due to absinthism, this addiction to absinthe? How was it poisoning the population? Why did Jean Lamfrey murder his family if it wasn't the 2 shots of diluted absinthe he drank early that morning? Because, my friends, it wasn't the trace amounts of wormwood being ingested by Jean Lamfrey and the rest of the degenerates. It was the massive quantities of alcohol, which in hindsight Yeah, it's pretty obvious. It didn't help that they were using super poor quality alcohol to make absinthe. Hicks concludes, quote, "Many now believe it unlikely that thujone, at least in the small amounts found in absinthe, can have a toxic effect. What then caused the absinthism observed by Magnan and his colleagues? Some suggest that without strong regulation and quality control, such adulterants as copper sulfate, antimony, or chloride could have poisoned absinthe drinkers, and inferior alcohol used by distillers eager to turn a quick profit could also have led to impaired vision, for example. But the most likely culprit is perhaps also the most obvious: ethanol. The most prominent ingredient in absinthe, after all, is alcohol. Maintaining wormwood in solution requires greater than 50% alcohol by volume. Stripped of its singular glamour and tabloid enchantments, absinthism looks like a much sadder and more common affliction: chronic alcoholism." End quote. So, I see major misconceptions here rooted in bad science and a greedy wine industry, spurred along by the adoption of absinthe by the artistic community, the counterculture, if you will, which never helps the cause of any substance, no matter how harmless. It's the same story over and over. A clear pattern emerges here. If you listened to my episode about cannabis, that was episode 98, or my episode about LSD, episode 125, then you surely see the pattern too. A naturally occurring substance, once used with great success medicinally, falls into the hands of creatives, whether it's black jazz musicians in New Orleans in the 1920s, tie-dye wearing hippies in San Francisco in 1969, or impressionist artists in France in the 1880s, and suddenly it's blamed for every single problem that exists in society: the poisoning of the population, the degeneration, the rage, the murders, the insanity. I see a lot of parallels, especially between absinthe and cannabis, because cannabis was blamed for murders and violence as well. They claimed that it was making people go crazy and go on all these murder sprees and kill their families and that sort of thing. Very similar to the story of Jean Lamfrey and the absinthe murders. Except we now know that the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, THC, does not do this. It does not have this effect on the brain. Neither, we now know, does thujone, the active ingredient in wormwood that's in absinthe. These were the main on-paper reasons that these substances were banned, because they made people go crazy and murder their families. Except that's completely false and scientifically disproven. I find it really interesting, this court of public opinion that forms, and the way that the tiniest suggestion, like Magnan's worthless experiments, can lead to a snowball effect, a witch hunt, where something natural and actually quite useful, cannabis, wormwood, these plants that grow in the ground, they become so misunderstood and so feared by the people that we ban them. We make them illegal so that no humans can use them anymore. All of this spurred along, of course, by powerful entities with strong ulterior motives like France's wine industry, prodding an agitated bull. And in the end, the paranoia, the fear-based misconceptions have us so blind that we completely overlook common sense, that we ignore the 7 glasses of strong wine and an extra liter later plus a brandy drink that Jean Lamfrey drank hours after the absinthe and just before murdering his family in a drunken rage and passing out in the front yard before waking up with no memory of any of it. Was it the absinthe? Was it that tiny bit of wormwood oil? Or was it all of that alcohol? I'm always intrigued by the psychology of history, and I find the psychology of banning things, of cancel culture, really interesting and honestly pretty terrifying, because it's so often not based in common sense. It's so often driven by fear and paranoia and ulterior motives, manipulation and trickery. So I guess the moral of this story is to keep your wits about you, right? Cling to common sense even when everyone else is drinking the Kool-Aid. Actually, you know what? You go on and drink the absinthe while everyone else is drinking the Kool-Aid. How about that? Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.